Good afternoon. Thanks to the organizers. I don't think any of them is here for the invitation. It's a great honor and pleasure to be able to talk to you today and to present this paper on emerging democracies in a multipolar world. And the reason is that the paper addresses the role of emerging democracies like India, Brazil, South Africa for global justice, and asks what the relevance of these countries and the rise of these countries is for global justice, whether they have a good impact or whether they have a bad impact. And I'm extremely curious to find out, in particular from the scholars in India, what they think about my ideas. And I have to confess that the discussion of this topic is by and large an exploration, because I haven't started, so I have been working on this project for not so long, and it's also a topic, as I will also point out in a second, that hasn't been really addressed in political theory so far. So let me now go through the presentation itself and restate that currently rising powers like Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, so not only democratic powers but also non-democratic powers, are fundamentally challenging the Western monopoly of power in world politics. That is, some countries that used to have a lot more power, in particular in North America and Europe, are these days losing a lot of power because other countries are becoming economically and also politically more powerful. However, if you look at the literature on global justice, you see that the debate is mainly framed about the obligations of the rich countries vis-a-vis the global poor, or about the developed world vis-a-vis the developing world. And it's not so often asked what the responsibility is of those populations, of those countries that occupy the space in between, so to speak, between the very rich countries and the very poor countries. And I don't know if you attended one of the lectures this morning by Jayatra, who was also saying that what she's criticizing in global justice theorizing is that the question about the responsibilities of the wealthy individuals in pretty wealthy states, even if not particularly rich states, but pretty wealthy states, is not often addressed. And also a professor here at Delhi University, Neeraj Chandhuke, she has a paper in this collection of essays on Thomas Pogge's work, where she asks, so what about us, Thomas Pogge, what about us, the people from the emerging economies and countries, what is our responsibility vis-a-vis the poor, be it the poor in the rich countries or the poor in the not so poor, the poor in really poor countries. So I think that global justice theory has done a pretty poor job so far in addressing these sorts of questions, and now I'm trying to explore this new terrain by asking a pretty simple question, namely how to assess this new and increasingly multipolar constellation in world politics. More specifically, I'm going to focus on a subset of these emerging powers, namely the democratic powers, in particular India, South Africa, and Brazil. So I'm going to bracket, for the time being, the question of what the impact is of the countries that are non-democratic, like China and Russia in particular. And my conclusion is going to be that, by and large, the new multipolar constellation actually promotes global justice, so there is reason for real optimism, not just fake optimism, but real optimism, because the new power constellations are actually supportive of bringing about greater global justice. So you now might ask, so what particular kind of global justice does he have in mind? And the answer is that I'm addressing this question from different perspectives of global justice. So I try to sketch different versions of global justice, which I call the globalist, the internationalist, and the statist conception of global justice. And then I see how these different conceptions of justice answer the question as to how to assess the new multipolar constellation. However, in this talk I'm going to focus on one particular conception of global justice, namely a conception that I call democratic internationalism, and later on in the presentation I will say a little bit more about this particular conception of global justice. Good, so what I'm going to do now, this is the structure of the presentation. I'm going to tell you some facts about rising power, so I'm going to substantiate the claim that there is actually a change of power relations taking place in current world politics. Thereafter I will try to explain in greater detail how the internal and external relations of emerging democracies are changing by focusing on the transformation of sovereignty that is taking place because of the rise of the democratic powers. Then I'm going to present this democratic internationalist conception of justice very quickly, just to have a normative base from which I will then carry out assessment of this new multipolar constellation. So I'm going to assess emerging democracies, and in particular the new constellation of world politics that these countries bring about, and then I'll conclude, of course. All right, so let me start by just enumerating a couple of facts, most of which you're probably familiar with regard to the rise of emerging democracies in global politics. So rising powers are normally defined as countries who possess veto player status but no agenda-setting capabilities in international negotiations. Furthermore, so that tells you a little bit about the political power that these countries possess, or how the political power of these countries is actually defined. Furthermore, the share of the global GDP of these so-called BRICS countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has doubled in the last 10 years from 9 to 18% of the global GDP, which is very substantial. And to give a third example, Brazil, who has been a debtor of the IMF in the 1980s, so it always had to pay back the loans that it has taken out from the IMF, now is a creditor of the IMF since 2009. So IMF, for example, is helping out countries like Greece in order to reintegrate into the monetary and financial system of the European Union. So that's really something entirely new. Okay, I mean that would have to be further qualified, of course, because I mean, as you know, some countries like Argentina have been very wealthy in the beginning of the 20th century or late 19th century. However, if you look at the last 50 or even 100 years, that's really different kind of constellation than what we've been used to, so to speak. Furthermore, many of the world's largest multinational corporations stem from rising powers. An example for this is the brewery, which is a Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate. It's called InBev, and it's the largest brewery in the entire world, and one of the most famous German beer brands, for example, is owned by this Brazilian company. So the Germans are actually drinking Brazilian beer, which for me, who's coming from Germany and from Frankfurt, is actually quite notable, to put it that way. All right. Furthermore, as you know, G20 meetings have become commonplace. G7, G8 meetings increasingly appear outdated, and the US has recently announced its Pacific Century, and the EU is negotiating new strategic partnerships with rising powers. So there's common awareness among the established powers that the rising powers are increasingly influential in world politics, and they have to cooperate with them, because otherwise they cannot achieve what they want to achieve in international politics. So that's the general framework and the change of the international power asymmetries, mainly having to do with the rise of economic power in rising powers, and I'm now going to focus on the transformation of sovereignty in emerging democracies in particular. So I'm going to look at a particular subgroup of these rising powers. And it's helpful to look at the transformation of sovereignty, because the transformation of sovereignty is a neat way to describe the change in internal and external relations within emerging democracies and also across emerging democracies and other states. And when you just look at the foreign policy rhetoric of countries like Brazil and also to some degree India, you get the idea that global politics is now going to be defined by a neo-Westphalian order in which countries like Brazil and India are going to not give away any kind of sovereignty, but they're going to insist that the state is the only authority who can legitimately exercise political power, and sovereignty is not going to be shared. If that would be the case, that would be very problematic for most theories of global justice, because most theories of global justice assume that there needs to be some kind of cooperation between states and international institutions, and this cooperation needs to be facilitated by the sharing of sovereignty, because otherwise the cooperation simply wouldn't be sufficiently effective to bring about the kinds of changes that principles of global justice requires. So if the foreign policy rhetoric of these countries would be indeed true and would resemble the reality, that would be a problem for realizing global justice. However, empirical findings show that the rhetoric is just rhetoric and reality looks a bit different, and the way that I try to describe this kind of reality in the paper is by using the term soft sovereignty, which a colleague of mine has dubbed, and I'm picking up this term that he has coined. And soft sovereignty is a concept of sovereignty or conception of sovereignty that wants to describe the fact that it is indeed the case that there have been a lot of sovereignty strengthening aspects occurring due to the rise of emerging democracies. So due to the greater economic capacity and the resulting increasing new global multipolarity, it's indeed the case that countries like India have more bargaining power, they're more independent from international institutions, they're more independent from other countries, because they are powerful enough to be able to say at times, no, that's not the way we're going to move things forward, and therefore they're independent from other actors, and in this sense they actually have this kind of Westphalian sovereignty where the exercise of political power really resides in one particular source of political authority. However, on the other hand, there are also a number of sovereignty compromising aspects of this new multipolar constellation, and I will just go through them now very quickly. One is regional integration, which refers to the fact that many of these emerging democracies, they're involved within schemes of regional integration. And so, speaking now for the case of Brazil, Brazil is involved in the Mercosur, and in the Mercosur, Brazil has taken on various responsibilities for other neighboring states. They've initiated, for example, a development fund which forces Brazil to contribute to several kinds of development projects throughout Latin America, and as a consequence of that, they need to be sensitive to the concerns of other countries and the population of other countries, and this, of course, is compromising their sovereignty. Besides, established international institutions in which these emerging democracies participate also constrain the sovereignty of emerging democracies. The case in point is the United Nations and the principle or the concept of responsibility to protect, which is a principle that Brazil initially tried to refuse and tried not to actually follow through, because it said, well, responsibility to protect gives too much power to international institutions to decide whether or not it is adequate to intervene at a particular time in a particular country. However, in the meantime, Brazil actually has proposed to amend this principle of responsibility to protect, and said that we also need to look at the responsibility while protecting, and thus proposed an amendment of the principle. But by proposing an amendment, Brazil at the same time also accepted the validity of the principle of the responsibility to protect. So that's just one example that shows you how emerging democracies say that they want to be neo-Westphalian, that they don't want to comply with supranational norms and standards. However, in practice, they at some point get caught up in the norms of international institutions and supranational institutions, and thereby they also lose some part of their sovereignty. And the final aspect of the sovereignty compromising component of this new multipolar constellations is the increasing transnational juridification of protest, which describes the fact that increasingly social movements are using the language of international legal human rights in order to voice their claims vis-a-vis the government and also vis-a-vis other international actors or private corporations within their territories. And as a consequence of that, these social movements are forcing their governments to comply to certain transnational norms that have been established at the international level, and thereby they're also compromising the sovereignty of their states, because through the language of international legal human rights, the states are bound to follow these particular norms that they themselves at some point have agreed to, but then have no longer the choice whether or not to follow them. Good, so how are we to assess this new global situation in which emerging democracies have increasingly more power? This of course depends, as I said earlier, on the particular kind of conception of global justice that you use in order to assess the situation, and I'm using a democratic international conception of global justice, which puts forward mainly two kinds of claims. And the one claim is that global justice requires reasonably democratic arrangements within all states, so all states should become reasonably democratic. That's the one requirement, and the other requirement is that the relations among states should also be reasonably democratic, which means that the ideal of a certain kind of democratic decision-making ought to be the guiding principle at the international level, not just at the domestic level, and bargaining should not be the default position for international relations. And this has, of course, these two principles have various implications with regard to kinds of economic and political inequalities that are legitimate within states and across states, and now the question is whether the rise of the emerging democracies actually helps to realize these demands or not. And my assessment is that emerging democracies' exercise of sovereignty actually promotes global justice domestically, and thereby fulfills the first requirement of the democratic internationalist conception of global justice. And this is because greater economic capacities, at least in general, facilitate more democratic domestic arrangements. And here the idea simply is that you have to have a certain degree of economic prosperity in order to be able to implement the kinds of political institutions that a democracy requires. And furthermore, the juridification of protests that I referred to just a minute ago fosters the rule of law and also fosters the fulfillment of human rights, and thereby also promotes the achievement of democracy within emerging democracies. So much for the intra-national or domestic condition of this democratic internationalist conception of global justice, and now looking at how the exercise of soft sovereignty by emerging democracies affects the international relations. I think one can observe that the sharing of sovereignty with regional and international institutions that is shown in the behavior of emerging democracies actually shows that they are willing to comply with inter and supranational norms, and even more importantly perhaps, the new multipolarity decreases the power asymmetries between states. And as a result of this reduction in inequality between states, there's a greater hope or a greater chance of success that democratic arrangement between states will actually materialize. So I'm not saying that having less power asymmetries per se or having less economic inequalities per se is equivalent to democratic arrangements. However, I think that in the long run, if you want to have democratic arrangements, you can only have so much of inequality in economic terms and terms of power in order to allow for democratic decision making. All right, so I have drawn these rather positive conclusions, and in the paper have various qualifications saying that there are also various impediments to the realization of such a conception of global justice, but I won't go into these at this point, but rather come to a conclusion. So my point of departure has been that the theories of global justice so far have been focusing mainly on the question about redistribution between developed and underdeveloped or developing states, and they haven't asked a different question which would have been necessary to ask if you would have taken into account that the actual reality is more complex and there's a greater variety of states and of actors, and in this greater complexity also forces you to ask a question about responsibilities of emerging democracies and of the populations in emerging democracies, and also forces you to think differently about how the world is faring in terms of global justice if you take into consideration that these power imbalances actually have been reduced quite dramatically in the last 10 or 20 years. So exploring this new terrain, the paper has analyzed transformation of sovereignty in emerging democracy and has found that emerging democracies exercise soft sovereignty, and then on the basis of the democratic international conception of justice, I've argued that this exercise of soft sovereignty is supportive of global justice. All right, that's it.
Thanks so much. So now we have about 10 minutes, 8 to 10 minutes for questions.
Agree totally with the starting point and your net assessment. And so I want to ask this question about the sort of fine-grained details. So I think the BRICS category is funny. There's nothing really in common between the countries that are put in the BRICS. So if you take a topic like UN reform, Brazil and India, South Africa, positive for UN reform. Russia and China, terrible. Or if you take climate change, you can do this again and again. So I'm just wondering, broadly, I think, yes, emerging countries that are challenging sort of unipolar world, that's generally good for global justice, but then with specific issues in global justice and specific countries in mind, you might think, boy, China's not really that positive for democratic internationalism, or boy, Russia's really not helping out on climate change or arms trade. So I just wanted to sort of comment that this is supposed to be an empirically informed paper. Are you giving us a net assessment across all emerging democracies, just those 5 countries, something else, and then what should we make of these outliers for specific cases?
Okay, yeah. Thanks for your comment and question. So I'm focusing on emerging democracies. So I'm excluding China and Russia. And in the paper I'm focusing in particular on the case of Brazil, and that was also the reason why many examples that I've used in the presentation also have drawn on the experience of Brazil. And I think that if you look at the emerging democracies, and not at all rising powers, but only the subset of emerging democracies, then this positive assessment is by and large justified. However, as I said, it's just an exploration of this new terrain, and a fully comprehensive assessment would have to take into consideration the negative impacts of the of countries like Russia and China. And then also, of course, not everything that these emerging democracies have been doing in the last 10, 20 years has been positive from a global justice perspective. So, for example, the relation between emerging democracies and their neighbors and weaker states and the least developed countries has been very problematic, because now these countries that have gained more power are now exercising this power in arbitrary ways vis-a-vis the less powerful countries, and are dominating in ways that they haven't been dominating other countries before.
Hi, just a small question.
This is in regards to the entire idea of the transnational jurisdiction of protest as a particular point that you put there. In case of emerging democracies, like emerging democracies that we were talking about, especially in a situation of conflict, generally in such a situation, the entire idea of the transnational aspect of protest itself, can it also not be looked at the other way? Looked at the other way around? If we just flip the coin the other way, the entire idea of transnational aspect of protest can also be used or incorporated by a democratic country or a government itself to also close down the system further. Probably, if I'm not clear enough, just as an example, with respect to say Kashmir in India, any or every international idea of protest or any particular such protest that is there, including the amnesty reports on Kashmir itself, is at this point in time, not just does not have a particular sense of legitimacy according to the government, but at the same time, any and every protest that emanates from such a discourse, be it inside India or be it outside India, is used to create two things. Number one, the identity of an Indian nation itself, which also probably has to do with certain growing ideologies right now, might be unrelated, but still. So that also closes down the entire national space itself. And secondly, this also further delegitimizes the entire discourse on rights and the international pressures on certain other issues probably. And I'm not so sure if this link is very direct. So probably something like the LGBT rights itself has also not been able to gain enough importance in India, unfortunately. But probably is it something which is as directly linked to the issue of the entire idea of protest being delegitimized itself by a particular government? So is transnational actually reducing the sovereignty of a particular country, or is it just helping reinforce the sovereignty of a particular country in a closed space itself? Thank you.
Sorry, Bakir, could you just repeat the one right that you think that hasn't been properly respected?
All I'm asking is the transnational aspect of protest at this given point in time. Does it in fact reduce the entire idea of a country's sovereignty, or is it also used as a particular tool to reinforce a particular country's nationalistic aspect, as a result of which the entire system of the country might end up just being closed down further? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I'm open to the possibility that there are cases in which it has the opposite effect of what I was describing, in the sense that transnationalization of human rights and juridification of human rights will actually lead to the fostering of sovereignty of a particular country. And you might have cases in mind that I'm not familiar with and that very much fit in this scheme. However, I would think that in general, if you look at the logic of human rights, they should actually, the way that we understand international human rights is driven by the idea that states have the primary responsibility to protect these human rights, and in this sense there's a great degree of sovereignty that actually states can exercise. However, at the same time, once that there's a certain degree of abuse of human rights, it's also legitimate for the international community not only to support by non-violent means certain forces within the country in order to help the realization of human rights, but also at a certain point to intervene by force and actually protect the human rights. So that's basically the doctrine of the responsibility to protect. And in that sense, one of the essential characteristics of human rights actually is a sovereignty compromising aspect of human rights, even if it has the promotion of sovereignty as its goal in the long run. But nevertheless, it puts a clear constraint on the exercise of sovereignty. So the emergence of human rights as an international legal practice is basically the watershed between a Westphalian understanding of sovereignty and international relations and a, say, post-Westphalian human rights-based understanding where you have clear set limits for the exercise of sovereignty. So if you take this idea of human rights seriously, and which is in the doctrine, in the legal doctrine of human rights, then there's a clear sense in which it is sovereignty compromising, even if there are still other cases in which it might have the opposite effect.
So we have time for one more question. Christine?
That was really interesting. I just had a quick question about soft sovereignty. And I guess the way you described it, it made it sound a bit like a lot of these countries say a lot of big claims about their sovereignty, but when it comes down to it, they kind of have to concede to the norms of the international sphere, which were set by other states and by other people in the past. And I guess my question is, that to me seems like something we might want to worry a bit about rather than kind of see as an altogether good thing. And you seem to be kind of seeing the soft sovereignty as a really good thing for the ways in which it helps global justice questions. And I was wondering if it might be a bit more complicated than that, if you had any thoughts.
Do you have a particular example in mind, or, I mean, you're generally suspicious of the justifiability of international norms, I presume. So it's problematic if emerging democracies concede too much sovereignty to these institutions because they might not be legitimate and not justifiable, but rather be dominating and imperial in one way or the other.
I mean, you could put it like that. I guess the thought, I hadn't kind of come up with a specific example, but was more kind of the way you phrased it in terms of they had certain aspirations themselves about what their sovereignty would be, and they had to concede on those. So it's less a question about which are the right social norms and more a question of who's determining them in that particular context.
Okay, good. So I think I think a good way to reply is to say that any plausible conception of global justice, or even the most conservative conception of global justice, if you take a conception of Michael Blake or Thomas Nagel, who are statist theorists and who basically say that globally only a certain level of sufficiency is required and equality is only required within states, even these theorists need to concede that states ought to give up some parts of their sovereignty in order to realize these principles of sufficiency. I mean, on the empirical assumptions that without the cooperation of states, at least where we stand now, it's unlikely that all states will be able to achieve a certain level of sufficiency. And you can challenge this on empirical grounds, however, I think that would be difficult. But if you follow me in these assumptions, then I think you need to have the willingness of all states to defer some degree of sovereignty to international institutions, and that's why it's important that emerging democracies are willing to concede some degrees of sovereignty. But of course it matters which kind of sovereignty you defer and which kind you want to stick with, so to speak, or keep for yourself.